October 1945. Hollington, Northumberland. In the gray, wind-swept expanse of a British prisoner of war camp, a sound both strange and profound echoed against the damp timber of the mess hall. It was the sound of weeping, not the bitter, angry sobs of the defeated, nor the desperate cries of the homesick. This was a different kind of grief, a catharsis so deep it seemed to shake the very foundations of the women who produced it. These were the former standard-bearers of the Third Reich, nurses, secretaries, and auxiliaries of the Bund Deutscher Madel, captured in the final, chaotic collapse of Germany. They sat hunched over plain wooden tables, their faces buried in their hands, their shoulders racked with a sorrow that was also, paradoxically, a kind of release. Before them, on simple tin plates, sat the cause of this emotional storm, a steaming portion of beef stew. But it was not the meat, a rare luxury, that had broken them. It was the carrots, bright orange, perfectly tender, glistening with a hint of butter and thyme. They wept for a vegetable, a root they had been taught, from their earliest days, was fit only for livestock. That a simple carrot, cooked with care, could shatter the ideological armor of an entire generation of women is one of the quiet, forgotten paradoxes of the war. It begs a question that cuts to the very heart of how we see our enemies and ourselves. What could possibly happen in a prison camp to make women, raised on a doctrine of absolute superiority, weep in gratitude for what they once called pig food? Before we explore how a common garden vegetable became the catalyst for a profound moral awakening, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. For the answer to this mystery begins not in the mud of an English camp, but in the pristine, orderly mind of a young German nurse named Elsbeth Richter, as she was herded onto a cattle car in the summer of 1945, utterly convinced she was on her way to hell. Elsbeth, a native of Dresden, was a product of her time, which is to say she was a product of meticulous, all-encompassing indoctrination. Her world, until the firestorms had consumed it, had been one of absolute certainty. She believed in the Führer, in the destiny of the German people, and in the inherent inferiority of her enemies. The British, according to the ceaseless torrent of propaganda that had shaped her reality, were a degenerate race of shopkeepers, physically weak, morally corrupt, and possessed of a brutish cruelty hidden beneath a thin veneer of civilization. Their food was tasteless, their industry was collapsing, and their soldiers were cowards. To be captured by them was to be delivered into the hands of monsters. Every creak of the train wheels heading west was a rhythmic confirmation of her fate. She sat pressed against other women, their faces pale with a shared, unspoken terror. They would be starved. They would be beaten. They would be humiliated in ways their minds could barely conjure. Elsbeth steeled herself for this inevitability, her jaw set, her nursing instincts repurposed for her own survival. She would be strong. She would endure. She would show these British animals the unyielding spirit of a true German woman. This conviction was her only shield against the gnawing fear in her stomach. The landscape that eventually rolled past the gaps in the cattle car walls was alien and desolate, a panorama of greens and grays under a perpetually weeping sky. It looked exactly as she had imagined, bleak, joyless, and utterly foreign. It was the perfect backdrop for the horrors that awaited her. When the train finally shuddered to a halt and the heavy doors were thrown open, the bright, damp air felt like a slap. Her first sight of her captors did nothing to dispel her prejudice. They were older men, mostly, part of the Home Guard, their uniforms ill-fitting, their faces weathered and weary. They looked tired, not terrifying. But Elsbeth knew better. This was the trick, the deceptive face of the enemy. The real cruelty would begin once they were behind the wire. She held her head high as she was marched towards the camp gates, a defiant posture against the crushing weight of her own expectations. She was Elsbeth Richter, a German nurse, and she was ready for the worst her captors could throw at her. She had no way of knowing that the greatest assault on her identity would not come from a fist or a curse, but from a simple act of kindness, and a vegetable she thought she understood. The certainty that armored her heart was about to be dismantled, piece by painful piece, by the quiet, undeniable truth of reality. The arrival at Hollington prisoner of war camp was an exercise in anticlimax. There was no gauntlet of jeering soldiers, no snarling dogs, no immediate segregation for brutal interrogation. There was only mud, barbed wire, and a sense of weary, bureaucratic order. The women were lined up in the persistent drizzle, their names checked against a list by a stern-faced female officer from the Auxiliary Territorial Service. The process was cold and impersonal, but it was not cruel. This initial absence of malice was, for Elsbeth, deeply unsettling. It was a deviation from the script she had memorized, the narrative of suffering she had prepared for. The true horror, she reasoned, was being saved for later. She watched everything with the keen, analytical eye of a nurse, searching for signs of the barbarism she knew must be lurking beneath the surface. She was introduced, along with her fellow prisoners, to the camp's commandant for their section, a man named Sergeant Arthur Davies. He was not the monstrous figure of propaganda. He was a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and eyes that held a profound sense of exhaustion rather than hatred. He addressed them in halting, heavily accented German, his voice calm and even. He laid out the rules of the camp. They were prisoners of war. They were expected to work. They were to obey orders without question. Any insubordination would be punished according to the regulations of the Geneva Convention. The mention of the convention was the first crack in Elsbeth's armor. The propaganda had been clear. The Allies considered the German people to be subhuman criminals, unworthy of the protections of international law. To hear this tired, unimposing man invoke it as a matter of course was a dissonance she could not immediately resolve. Magda, a sharp-featured woman who had been a Luftwaffe communications assistant, leaned over and whispered, her voice laced with venom. Propaganda. Words. They say that for the Red Cross. Wait until the inspectors are gone. Elsbeth nodded, clinging to Magda's cynicism as a familiar anchor in a sea of confusing signals. The processing continued. They were led to a delousing station, a moment they all dreaded, bracing for humiliation. But here, too, the reality was jarringly different. The British orderlies, all women, were brisk and professional. They were firm, but they did not mock or leer. They were handed coarse soap and told to wash thoroughly. The water that came from the taps was hot, steaming hot, for women who had spent the last months of the war in bombed-out cellars. Washing with cold water and slivers of gritty ersatz soap, the sensation of abundant hot water was a shocking, decadent luxury. It felt wrong. It felt like a trick. As she scrubbed her skin, Elsbeth felt a wave of guilt. How could she be enjoying this comfort at the hands of the enemy? She thought of her family, her fiancé on the Eastern Front from whom she hadn't heard in a year. What were they suffering while she stood here, enveloped in steam? The feeling was a complex cocktail of relief, confusion, and self-loathing. Afterward, they were given medical examinations. Elsbeth, as a nurse, observed the British doctor with a critical eye. She expected a cursory, contemptuous inspection. Instead, the man was methodical, his touch gentle. He noticed a festering cut on the leg of a younger woman, Ingrid, and immediately set about cleaning and dressing it with proper antiseptic and a clean bandage. He spoke to her softly, his tone reassuring. Ingrid, who had been stoic until that point, burst into tears, not from pain, but from the unexpected tenderness of the gesture. Magda sneered quietly. They want us healthy for the work gangs. A lame horse is no good to a farmer. Elsbeth wanted to agree. She needed to agree, but she had seen the doctor's face. It was not the face of a cold pragmatist. It was the face of a healer. He had treated Ingrid the same way Elsbeth would have treated a patient in her hospital in Dresden. This shared professionalism, this common ground of care, was a more profound challenge to her worldview than any argument could have been. It suggested a shared humanity she had been taught did not exist. The barracks were next. They were simple wooden huts, long and narrow, filled with two-tiered bunks. They were Spartan, but they were clean. Each bunk had a mattress filled with straw and 2 coarse wool blankets. A small iron stove stood in the center of the room. It was a prison, without a doubt, but it was a far cry from the disease-ridden pit she had envisioned. As they settled in, the sheer ordinariness of it all continued to gnaw at her. Where was the overt cruelty? Where was the screaming and the savagery? This quiet, disciplined, and strangely humane environment was more frightening to her than a concentration camp would have been. A concentration camp would have confirmed her beliefs, validated her hatred, and affirmed her sense of martyrdom. This place, Hollington, did the opposite. It chipped away at the foundations of her reality with every small, inexplicable act of decency. That first evening, as she lay on her bunk, listening to the rain drumming on the roof and the quiet sobbing of some of the other women, Elsbeth felt a terrifying thought begin to form in her mind, a thought she immediately tried to suppress. What if they were wrong? What if everything they had been told about the enemy was a lie? The thought was so dangerous, so treasonous, that she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force it out. She conjured images of the Allied bombers over Dresden, of the leaflets filled with hateful caricatures of Germans. She clung to her hatred because, in this strange new world, it was the only thing that still felt like home. The first days in the camp unfolded with a monotonous rhythm that slowly, inexorably, ground down the women's expectations of immediate brutality. The routine was rigid: wake-up call before dawn, a meager breakfast, a full day of labor, a simple supper, and then confinement to the barracks. It was the life of a prisoner, yet within that framework, a series of subtle revelations began to dismantle the architecture of their indoctrinated beliefs. The most fundamental of these revelations came, as it so often does, through food. The propaganda had been explicit on this point. The British were starving, their island nation cut off and destitute, their people subsisting on tasteless, boiled scraps. The prisoners expected watery soup, bread filled with sawdust, and portions designed to weaken and demoralize them. The first breakfast served in the mess hall seemed, at first, to confirm this. They were given a ladle of lumpy porridge and a mug of weak ersatz tea. Magda tasted hers and made a face of theatrical disgust. Dishwater and paste, she declared loud enough for those around her to hear. Even our stable boys ate better. But Elsbeth, who had experienced the final, desperate months in Germany, knew differently. The porridge was unappetizing, yes, but it was hot and filling. It was made from real oats, not floor sweepings. The bread they were given, a single thick slice each, was dense and dark, but it was solid bread. It did not crumble into dust and would pulp as the bread at home had done. She ate in silence, her hunger overriding her prejudice. She noticed Sergeant Davies watching them from the corner of the hall, his expression unreadable. He wasn't gloating at their meager fare. He seemed to be observing, assessing. The work they were assigned was grueling. Many, like Elsbeth and Magda, who came from professional or urban backgrounds, were unaccustomed to manual labor. They were tasked with digging drainage ditches in the perpetually damp soil, clearing fields of stones, and working in the camp's extensive vegetable gardens. Their hands, once accustomed to holding scalpels or typing keys, quickly became blistered and raw. It was here, in the shared misery of the work details, that the social dynamics of the prisoners began to solidify. Magda was the voice of defiance, working with a sullen anger, her every movement a protest. She saw the hard labor as proof of British cruelty, a deliberate attempt to break their spirits. "They work us like slaves because they are too weak to work themselves," she would mutter, leaning on her spade. "This is their revenge." Ingrid, the young woman whose leg had been treated by the doctor, represented another perspective. She was quieter, more pragmatic. The war had exhausted her, and for her, the physical labor was a strange kind of anesthetic. "It is better than waiting for the bombs to fall," she said once, wiping sweat from her brow. "At least here, the sky is empty." Elsbeth found herself somewhere in the middle, caught between Magda's rigid cynicism and Ingrid's weary acceptance. Her body ached, her muscles screamed, but her mind was in even greater turmoil. She worked methodically, her nurse's discipline translating to the repetitive tasks. But as she worked, she watched. She watched the British guards who oversaw them. They were not the whip-wielding sadists of her imagination. They were mostly older men, veterans of the First War, who carried their rifles with a kind of resigned boredom. They were strict about the rules, shouting at any woman who slacked off, but their reprimands were devoid of the ideological hatred she expected. They seemed to be men doing a job they didn't particularly enjoy. One afternoon, a heavy downpour started, turning the field into a quagmire. The women huddled together, shivering in their thin coats. Elsbeth fully expected to be forced to work through it, a classic display of enemy spite. But after a few moments, the guard in charge, a corporal with a drooping mustache, grumbled something to himself and then shouted, "All right, you're no use to me soaked. Back to the barracks, the lot of you." As they trudged back, Magda was triumphant. "See, their discipline is weak. A German soldier would never surrender to a little rain." But Elsbeth saw it differently. It wasn't weakness. It was common sense, practicality. There was no value in forcing them to work in conditions that would only lead to sickness. It was an act of pragmatism, not pity, but it was a pragmatism that stemmed from a view of them as assets to be managed, not as vermin to be exterminated. The most significant contradiction to the propaganda, however, was not the food or the labor, but the sanitation. The latrines were basic, but they were cleaned regularly. And there was the constant, unbelievable presence of soap and hot water. The doctrine of German superiority was deeply intertwined with notions of cleanliness and order, while the enemy was portrayed as dirty and chaotic. Yet here, in this prison camp, the standards of hygiene were higher than anything Elsbeth had experienced in the last year of the war. Every evening, the women would queue for their turn at the wash basins, the steam rising around them. The simple, domestic act of washing became a ritual of deep cognitive dissonance. How could these unhygienic people provide such a thing for their prisoners? Magda had an answer for everything. "They are terrified of disease," she argued. "They know that one outbreak of typhus would sweep through their own ranks. It is not for us. It is for their own self-preservation." It was a plausible argument, and Elsbeth tried to hold on to it. But day by day, the weight of evidence was mounting against the towering edifice of lies she had mistaken for the truth. Every interaction, every observation, was a small hammer tap against its foundations. She felt it cracking, felt the cold light of a different reality seeping through, and it terrified her. To lose her hatred was to lose her identity. To accept the humanity of her captors was to confront the inhumanity of the regime she had served. And so she fought it, clinging to Magda's bitter narrative, searching for the cruelty she knew must be there, just waiting to reveal itself. The revelation would come, but not in the way she expected. It wouldn't be found in an act of violence, but in the most mundane of places, the camp kitchen and a basket of humble orange roots. The work assignments were rotated every few weeks, a strategy Sergeant Davies employed to prevent both monotony and the formation of entrenched, disruptive cliques. When Elsbeth, Magda, and Ingrid were reassigned from the fields to the camp kitchen, a collective sigh of relief went through their small group. Kitchen duty meant shelter from the relentless Northumberland wind and rain. It meant warmth from the large cast-iron stoves. And it meant proximity to food, which held a primal psychological comfort even if they weren't allowed to take any extra. The kitchen was a vast, steamy chamber, loud with the clang of metal pots and the shouted orders of the head cook, a portly, perpetually flustered British sergeant. The prisoner's main task was preparation. Endless mountains of potatoes to be peeled, cabbages to be shredded, and onions to be chopped. It was repetitive and mind-numbing work, but it was better than digging ditches. It was during their first week in the kitchen that the carrots arrived. They came in large burlap sacks, delivered by a local farmer's truck. When the sacks were opened, they revealed a trove of enormous, vibrant orange carrots, still dusted with dark, rich soil. They were impressive in their size and color, a testament to the fertility of the land. But to the German women, they were an immediate and unambiguous insult. Magda was the first to give voice to their collective disgust. She picked up one of the huge roots, holding it between her thumb and forefinger as if it were something unclean. "Futtermoren," she said, the word dripping with contempt. "Feed carrots." She was right. In Germany, there was a distinct and well-understood hierarchy of carrots. The small, slender, sweet varieties were grown for human consumption. These massive, pale-cored ones were cultivated specifically as fodder for livestock, for pigs, horses, and cattle. To be served them was not merely a matter of culinary preference. It was a clear and deliberate statement. It was a sign that their captors viewed them as animals. The sentiment spread like wildfire through the prisoners on kitchen duty. The carrots became a potent symbol of their humiliation. Peeling them was an act of degradation. Each scrape of the knife was a reminder of their fallen status. "They mock us," a woman from Hamburg muttered, her eyes flashing with anger. "They give us pig food and probably keep the good food for themselves." Elsbeth felt the same surge of indignation. This, finally, was the cruelty she had been looking for. It was not the overt brutality of the fist, but the subtle, soul-crushing humiliation of being treated as subhuman. Her confusion and doubts of the past weeks solidified into a cold, hard certainty. The hot water, the medical care, it was all a facade. This was the truth. This was how the British truly saw them. She remembered her family's small victory garden behind their apartment in Dresden. She remembered sorting the vegetables with her mother. The sweet, tender carrots for the Sunday roast, and the large, woody ones for her uncle's rabbits. The distinction was as clear as night and day. These were, unequivocally, animal feed. The women's work slowed, becoming sullen and resentful. They handled the carrots with theatrical disdain, peeling them aggressively, chopping them into crude, uneven chunks. It was a small, petty act of rebellion, their only way of protesting the insult. The British cook sergeant, busy with a dozen other tasks, seemed not to notice their simmering anger. He just yelled at them to work faster. But Sergeant Davies noticed. He had a habit of making quiet, unobtrusive tours of the camp, his eyes missing nothing. He entered the kitchen and stood for a long time by the door, watching the women at the preparation table. He saw the way they handled the carrots, the angry set of their jaws, the contemptuous flick of their wrists as they tossed the peeled roots into the pots. He saw Magda hold one up and say something to the woman next to her, prompting a bitter laugh. Davies did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning perfectly. He saw a rebellion brewing over a vegetable. He could have reacted with force, punishing them for their insubordination. He could have ignored it, dismissing it as the petulant behavior of defeated prisoners. He did neither. Instead, he approached the table, his expression thoughtful. The women fell silent, expecting a reprimand. But he simply picked up one of the large carrots, turning it over in his hands. He looked at it. Then he looked at them, a question in his eyes. He didn't understand the cultural context, but he recognized that this object, this simple carrot, had become the focal point for all their stored-up anger, prejudice, and pain. For Elsbeth, this was a critical moment. She braced herself for the confrontation, ready to meet his anger with her own cold defiance. She was prepared for a fight. She was not prepared for what he did next. Sergeant Davies stood there for a long moment, the large carrot resting in the palm of his hand. The silence in the kitchen was thick with tension, broken only by the hiss of the steam from the large cooking pots. The women watched him, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. Elsbeth could feel her heart pounding. This was it, the moment the mask of civility would drop. Davies looked from the carrot to the stony faces of the prisoners, and a flicker of understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes. He didn't know the specifics of German agricultural traditions, but he was a farmer's son from Devon. He understood the land, and he understood people. He recognized that this was not about insubordination, it was about dignity. Without a word, he walked over to a crate, pulled on a pair of work gloves, and picked up a peeler. He returned to the long preparation table, found a small space between Elsbeth and Ingrid, and began to peel a carrot. The gesture was so unexpected, so completely outside the established hierarchy of guard and prisoner, that it stunned the women into immobility. They stared, peelers and knives held frozen in midair, as the camp commandant quietly set to work alongside them. Magda shot Elsbeth a look of pure astonishment, her mouth slightly agape. This was not in the script. This was not how a victor was supposed to behave. Sergeant Davies worked with a practiced efficiency, the orange peelings falling away in long, neat strips. He did not speak. His presence alone was a powerful statement, though what it stated was not yet clear. He was not ordering them. He was not berating them. He was, in a quiet, unassuming way, joining them in their labor. His action diffused the volatile atmosphere instantly. The anger and resentment that had filled the room moments before now seemed childish and misplaced. How could you maintain your righteous fury when the target of your contempt was standing beside you, sharing your task? Slowly, hesitantly, the women resumed their work, their movements now self-conscious and uncertain. The previous mood of sullen protest was replaced by a confused, awkward silence. After a few minutes, Davies paused. He held up a peeled carrot. In England, he said, speaking slowly in his careful, formal German, a big carrot is a good carrot. More to eat. He gestured to the pot of water where the carrots were being collected. Just boiled. Yes, not so good. Bland. He made a face, a small, conspiratorial grimace that was shockingly human. But there are other ways. He walked over to the cook's station and, after a brief exchange with the flustered sergeant, returned with a few items that were, in the context of their Spartan existence, the equivalent of crown jewels. He held a small, greasy block of butter wrapped in paper, a tin of sugar, and a few sprigs of fresh thyme he must have picked from the small herb garden behind the kitchen. Magda scoffed under her breath, a reflexive act of cynicism. He is mocking us further, treating us like children with sweets. But Elsbeth was mesmerized. She watched as Davies, with the same methodical care he applied to everything, began to demonstrate. He sliced the carrot not into crude chunks, but into neat, uniform rounds. He motioned for a small pan and, over a low flame, melted a knob of the precious butter. The rich, nutty smell filled the air, a scent so evocative of home, of a life before the war, that it made Elsbeth's throat tighten. He added the carrot slices to the sizzling butter, tossing them gently. Then he did something extraordinary. He took a pinch of sugar and sprinkled it over the carrots. A little sugar, he explained, looking directly at Elsbeth, brings out the sweetness. A secret from my mother. Finally, he added the sprig of thyme. He let it all cook for a few minutes, the scent in the kitchen transforming from the bland smell of boiled vegetables into something rich, aromatic, and deeply appetizing. He took a fork, speared a single, glistening slice of carrot, and blew on it to cool it. Then, he held it out. Not to all of them. He held it out to Elsbeth. It was a direct challenge. A challenge to her prejudice, to her certainty, to the entire worldview she was desperately trying to protect. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse it. To accept a gift from the enemy was a form of surrender. To eat the very thing she had just scorned as pig food would be the ultimate humiliation. Magda's eyes were boring into her, cold and warning. The entire kitchen seemed to be holding its breath. Elsbeth looked at the piece of carrot on the fork. It no longer looked like an insult. It looked like food, prepared with care, offered with a strange, quiet respect. She looked at Sergeant Davies's face. There was no mockery in his eyes, no triumph. There was only a simple, earnest invitation, a bridge being extended across a chasm of hatred and misunderstanding. In that moment, her indoctrination and her lived experience were at war. The propaganda posters, the hate-filled speeches, the years of being told the British were monsters, all of it screamed no. But the evidence of her own senses, the smell of the butter, the quiet dignity of the man before her, the undeniable care that had gone into this simple act, whispered a different, more powerful word. Slowly, as if in a trance, she leaned forward and accepted the offering. The moment the piece of carrot touched Elsbeth's tongue was the moment her world fractured. All the intellectual arguments, all the carefully constructed justifications for her hatred, all the cynical interpretations of her captor's actions became utterly irrelevant in the face of a single, undeniable sensory truth. The carrot was not woody or bitter, as she had anticipated. The careful cooking had transformed it. It was shockingly sweet, the flavor intensified by the butter and the hint of sugar. It was tender, melting in her mouth with a delicate, earthy perfume from the thyme. It was, without exaggeration, the most delicious thing she had tasted in years. But it was more than just a flavor. It was a revelation. In that single, sweet, tender bite, the entire lie of her upbringing was exposed. The lie was not that this was pig food. The lie was the system of belief that had designated it as such. The lie was the arrogant, hollow certainty of cultural superiority that had led her and her entire nation down a path of destruction. The lie was the dehumanization of the other, the enemy, who, it turned in this profound instant, had a mother who knew that a pinch of sugar could make a simple carrot taste like a delicacy. The taste was the truth, and the truth was devastating. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, sprang to Elsbeth's eyes. They were not tears of sadness or of joy. They were tears of profound, soul-shattering shame. The shame of her own ignorance. The shame of her blind prejudice. She felt the rigid armor of her ideology, the fortress she had built around her heart, crumble into dust. She was not a proud German woman being humiliated by her captors. She was a fool, being shown a simple, basic truth by a man who had every reason to hate her, but had chosen instead to show her kindness. She tried to swallow. but her throat was constricted by a sob. She covered her mouth with her hand, her body shaking. The other women stared, wide-eyed. They had expected her to spit it out, to make a scene, to vindicate their shared contempt. They did not understand the nature of the tears they were witnessing. Sergeant Davies simply nodded, a flicker of sadness, or perhaps pity, in his eyes. He took the fork back, his point made more eloquently than any speech could have achieved. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. He had offered a truth, and he could see that it had been received. The spell was broken. Ingrid, her face a mask of curiosity, was the next to act. She hesitantly took a slice of carrot from the pan with her fingers. She put it in her mouth, and her eyes widened in exactly the same way Elsbeth's must have. A small, involuntary sound of pleasure escaped her lips. "It's good," she whispered, as if confessing a terrible secret. "It's very good." That was all it took. The dam of resistance broke. One by one, the other women in the kitchen reached for the pan, their movements tentative at first, then more eager. A chorus of surprised murmurs filled the room. The carrots, the symbol of their debasement, had become an object of desire. The largest culinary revelation was not just the taste, but the realization of their own wastefulness and arrogance. The British cook, seeing the change in atmosphere, came over. In broken German, he explained that the large carrots were what they used for stews and roasting precisely because their size made them efficient for mass peeling and their robust flavor held up to long cooking times. It wasn't an insult. It was simple, wartime practicality. A logic born of necessity, not malice. Magda alone stood apart, her arms crossed, her face a thunderous mask of betrayal. She watched her fellow prisoners eating the pig food with what looked like genuine enjoyment, and her expression curdled with disgust. "Fools," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You are fools. He has bewitched you with a bit of sugar. You trade your honor for a sweet taste. Have you forgotten everything? Have you forgotten who you are?" Elsbeth turned to face her, the tears still streaming down her cheeks. For the first time, she did not see a defiant patriot in Magda. She saw a frightened woman, clinging desperately to a sinking raft of lies because the truth of the open ocean was too terrifying to contemplate. "No, Magda," Elsbeth said, her voice quiet but clear. "We have not forgotten who we are. We are just now beginning to see it, and it is not something to be proud of." That evening, in the mess hall, the stew was served. It was rich with the sweet, aromatic carrots. A profound quiet fell over the hall as the women began to eat. There were no complaints, no sneers. Instead, across the room, Elsbeth saw other women, those who had not been in the kitchen, experience the same small, personal revelation she had. A look of surprise, a hesitant second bite, a shared glance of understanding. The story of what had happened in the kitchen had spread, and as they ate, a wave of emotion, a collective catharsis, washed over them. The sound of quiet weeping began at one table, then spread to another, and another, until the entire hall was filled with the sound of a shared, unspoken grief, a grief for their own blindness. They were not weeping for a carrot. They were weeping for the bitter truth it represented, that everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed for, was wrong. The carrot incident, as it came to be known in the quiet whispers between the prisoners, was more than just a culinary turning point. It was a psychological one. It did not magically erase the hardships of captivity, but it fundamentally altered the prisoners' perception of their circumstances and, more importantly, of their captors. The pervasive atmosphere of sullen resentment, which had been expertly stoked by cynics like Magda, began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative, questioning curiosity. The women started to observe their British guards not as monstrous caricatures, but as individual human beings. They noticed the way the older corporal with the mustache would share his tobacco ration with a younger soldier. They saw Sergeant Davies pausing to look at a photograph he kept in his wallet, his face softening with an expression of distinguishable longing. These were small, unremarkable moments of everyday humanity, but for women emerging from the fog of a totalitarian ideology that had denied such humanity to its enemies, they were seismic events. The change was most evident in the women's approach to their work. The petty acts of sabotage and deliberate slowness largely ceased. In the kitchen, the women began to take a strange, hesitant pride in their tasks. They scrubbed the potatoes with more vigor. They chopped the onions with a precision that went beyond mere obedience. They began to ask the British cook questions, using a mixture of broken English and sign language, about his techniques. They learned to make a simple, savory pastry for the top of the stew. They learned that adding a bay leaf to boiling cabbage could transform its flavor. They were not just preparing food anymore. They were learning to cook. This newfound spirit of cooperation spread to other areas of the camp. In the vegetable gardens, the women started to tend the plants with a care that bordered on affection. They weeded the beds meticulously. They asked for advice on how to protect the young seedlings from pests. They were, in essence, transforming their place of imprisonment into a place of productivity, finding a sliver of purpose in the fertile soil. Sergeant Davies fostered this change with a quiet, steady hand. He arranged for a small library of German books to be brought into the camp. He allowed the women to organize a choir, and soon the bleak Northumberland evenings were filled with the haunting, beautiful harmonies of Brahms and Schubert. These were not the actions of a man trying to break his prisoners' spirits, but of a man attempting to preserve their humanity. Magda, however, remained immune to this transformation. She saw the choir as a pathetic capitulation, the library as a tool for propaganda, and the interest in cooking as a grotesque betrayal of their heritage. She became the camp's Cassandra, a prophet of doom whom no one listened to anymore. Her cynicism, once a comforting shield for the others, now sounded shrill and hollow. She tried to rally the women, to remind them of their duty to hate. "They are fattening you up like geese for the slaughter," she would rage in the barracks at night. "They make you sing and cook so you will forget your homes, your families, the soldiers who died for you. You are dancing in your chains." Her audience, however, was no longer receptive. Ingrid, who had fully embraced the new reality, finally confronted her. "We are not dancing, Magda," she said calmly one evening, mending a tear in her uniform. "We are learning to live. There is no honor in hating. There is no strength in blindness. We were blind, and they have given us a chance to see." The ultimate confrontation, however, was between Magda and Elsbeth. Magda cornered Elsbeth near the wash basins, her eyes burning with a zealot's fire. "You started this," she accused, her voice low and venomous. "You were the first to eat their poison. You, a German nurse, a woman of science and discipline. How could you let them fool you?" Elsbeth finished washing her face, drying it slowly with her thin towel. She looked at Magda, not with anger, but with a deep, weary pity. "They are not monsters, Magda," she said, her voice even. "That is what we have learned. They are not heroes, either. They are just people. They are tired and they miss their families, just like us. They are practical, and sometimes they are kind. That is not poison. It is the truth." "The truth," Magda spat. "The truth is that they firebombed our cities. The truth is that they are trying to destroy our very souls with their petty kindnesses." "No," Elsbeth replied, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "They are not trying to destroy our souls. They are showing us that we barely had one left. We traded it for a uniform and a slogan and a hatred of everyone who was not like us. That stew, Magda, that simple food they make for us, has more soul in it than the entire Third Reich. Because it is honest. It is real. And we were wrong. We were wrong about everything." Magda stared at her, speechless. There was no argument against such a fundamental rejection of their shared past. She saw in Elsbeth's eyes not a traitor, but something far more terrifying, a convert, a person who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Magda backed away, shaking her head. She had lost. She was now the prisoner, not of the British, but of a dead ideology. She was trapped in a prison of her own making, while Elsbeth, in the middle of a POW camp, was finally, improbably, becoming free. The psychological chains that had bound Elsbeth far more tightly than any barbed wire were rusting away, broken by the simple, undeniable evidence of a shared and decent humanity. Months bled into one another, turning the bleak autumn of 1945 into a harsh winter, and then, slowly, into the pale, hopeful spring of 1946. The news from the outside world trickled in, painting a grim picture of the homeland the women had left behind. Germany was a nation in ruins, carved up by the victorious Allies, its people struggling with starvation, guilt, and the utter collapse of the society they had known. The letters the women received from their families spoke of unimaginable hardship, of a desperate search for food and shelter amidst the rubble. For the women in Hollington camp, a strange and deeply unsettling inversion of reality had taken place. Their prison had become a sanctuary. Behind the barbed wire, they were warm. They were clean. They were fed. They worked hard, but their labor was productive, and they ate the fruits of it. Outside the wire, in the world where they were supposedly free, lay chaos, hunger, and despair. The war was long over, and the process of repatriation began. Lists were posted, names were called, and small groups of women would be gathered, processed, and sent on the long journey back to Germany. For most, this was a moment of profound joy and relief, a bittersweet return to whatever remained of their former lives. They would be reunited with their families, and they would help to rebuild their shattered country. But for a small, significant number of the prisoners, the news of their impending release was not a cause for celebration. It was a source of deep anxiety. They had undergone a transformation that was more than just a change of mind. It was a change of heart. They had seen a different way of being, a different way of treating one another, and the thought of returning to a society poisoned by years of hatred and now consumed by bitterness and recrimination was terrifying. It was Elsbeth who first gave voice to this radical sentiment. During a routine work inspection, she gathered her courage and approached Sergeant Davies. Ingrid stood beside her for moral support. "Sergeant," Elsbeth began, her German formal and precise. "We have heard that our time for repatriation is coming soon." Davies nodded. "That's right, Richter. Your group is scheduled for next month." "Sir," Elsbeth continued, her heart pounding, "some of us do not wish to go." Davies stopped and looked at her, his expression one of complete bafflement. "You don't wish to go? This is a prison camp. People are supposed to want to leave." "We know this is unusual," Elsbeth said, her words rushing out now. "But our homes are gone. Our families are scattered. The country we knew no longer exists. Here we have work. We have food. We have learned things. We have learned that we were wrong. To go back now would be to return to the anger and the ruin. We want to stay, not as prisoners. We want to work. We are strong, and we are skilled. I am a nurse. Ingrid is an excellent seamstress. Others are good farmers now. We can help. We want to help rebuild, but we want to help rebuild here." Sergeant Davies stared at her, then at Ingrid, then back at Elsbeth. He was speechless. In all his years as a soldier, through 2 world wars, he had seen many things, but he had never heard of a prisoner of war begging to remain in captivity. He thought it must be a trick, or perhaps a sign of some psychological breakdown, a kind of institutionalization. That's not possible," he stammered. "The rules are clear. At the end of hostilities, prisoners of war are to be repatriated." "But the rules did not account for this," Ingrid interjected softly. "The rules did not account for us changing. We are not the same women who arrived here." Over the next few days, it became clear that Elsbeth and Ingrid were not alone. A petition was drawn up, written in careful, looping script on a piece of stolen ledger paper. It was signed by nearly 30 women. They were formally requesting to be paroled as civilian workers, to remain in the United Kingdom and contribute their labor to the post-war reconstruction effort. It was a life-altering decision, a profound and absolute rejection of their past. It was a choice to sever their roots, to turn their backs on the land of their birth, and to cast their lot with their former enemies. This was no fleeting emotional response. It was a calculated choice, born from months of observation and introspection. It was the ultimate consequence of the camp's quiet, humane regime. They had been sent to Hollington to be punished and contained. Instead, they had been re-educated, not by lectures or propaganda, but by the undeniable evidence of simple human decency. The petition was an act of profound faith, faith in the new selves they had become, and faith in the society that had, against all odds, shown them a better way to live. For Elsbeth, this was the final, definitive step in her transformation. Her old identity, the proud nurse of the Third Reich, was dead. In its place was a woman who defined herself not by her nationality or her ideology, but by her skills and her desire to heal. And she had come to the staggering conclusion that the place where she could do the most healing was not among the ruins of her homeland, but in the green and gentle landscape of her captivity. The petitions signed by Elsbeth, Ingrid, and 28 other women landed on the desk of the regional military authority with the force of a small, perplexing explosion. The request was unprecedented, a bureaucratic anomaly that fit into no existing category or protocol. The initial reaction from the higher command was one of deep suspicion. Was it a trick? A coordinated attempt by unrepentant Nazis to infiltrate British society? Was it a sign of mass hysteria, a psychological condition brought on by the trauma of war and captivity? The idea that these women had undergone a genuine change of heart and now preferred to live in the country of their captors was, to the official mind, simply too fantastic to be believed. The petition was initially rejected, and the order for the women's repatriation was confirmed. A profound sense of despair settled over the small group of signatories. It seemed their extraordinary journey of transformation was to end in a forced return to the very world they had chosen to reject. But they had an advocate they hadn't counted on. Sergeant Arthur Davies, the pragmatic farmer's son from Devon, was a man who believed in the evidence of his own eyes over the regulations in a book. He had witnessed the transformation firsthand. He had seen the sullen, resentful prisoners become diligent, cooperative workers. He had watched them weep over a simple meal, not from self-pity, but from a place of deep moral reckoning. He believed them. Risking his own modest career, Sergeant Davies wrote a long and detailed report to accompany the women's petition upon its appeal. He did not use the language of sentiment or philosophy. He used the practical, grounded language he knew his superiors would understand. He wrote of the women's exemplary work ethic, of their productivity in the camp's gardens, which had resulted in a significant surplus of food for the local community. He detailed their skills, Elsbeth's nursing qualifications, Ingrid's talents as a seamstress, others' proven abilities in farming and animal husbandry. He framed their request not as an emotional plea, but as a practical solution to Britain's own severe post-war labor shortages. Most powerfully, he described the carrot incident not as a moment of emotional breakdown, but as a turning point in camp morale and discipline, a clear indicator of the women's rejection of their former indoctrination. He was, in essence, vouching for them, staking his own credibility on their sincerity. His report, combined with the sheer novelty of the situation, prompted a review. A delegation of officials, including a psychologist, was sent to Hollington to interview the women. Elsbeth, as the group's de facto leader, was questioned for several hours. She spoke with a calm, clear-eyed honesty that was impossible to fake. She did not repudiate her country out of anger, but out of a sorrowful recognition of the poison that had infected it. She spoke of her desire to use her nursing skills to heal, and of her belief that she could better do so in a society that valued quiet decency over loud, fanatical ideology. Her testimony, and that of the other women, was compelling. The final decision was a very British compromise. The women would not be granted immediate citizenship, but they would be released on a special probationary parole. They would be assigned as civilian workers to farms and hospitals in the rural Northumberland area that were desperately short of staff. They would be paid a minimal wage and housed in designated hostels, their movements restricted and their conduct closely monitored. It was not freedom, not yet, but it was a chance. The day of the separation was charged with emotion. The women who were being repatriated boarded the trucks, their faces a mixture of joy for their own return and confusion at the choice of those staying behind. Magda was among them. She gave Elsbeth one last look, a look of pure, uncomprehending pity. "You will regret this," she said, her voice flat. "You have chosen a cage of your own making." Elsbeth simply shook her head. "No, Magda. I have chosen a future." As the trucks pulled away, Elsbeth, Ingrid, and the others stood and watched until they were out of sight. They were now in a strange limbo, no longer prisoners, but not yet free. They were aliens in a foreign land, pioneers of a life they would have to build from scratch. The immediate consequences were difficult. Elsbeth was assigned to a small rural clinic, where her presence was initially met with suspicion and hostility by the local population who had lost sons and husbands in the war. Children would sometimes whisper "Nazi" as she passed in the street. But she did not react with anger or despair. She reacted with the quiet, unyielding competence she had learned was the most effective response. She worked tirelessly, taking on the most difficult and unpleasant tasks without complaint. She was gentle with the elderly and patient with frightened children. Her skill as a nurse was undeniable, and slowly, painstakingly, she began to earn the respect and then the trust of the community. She was no longer Elsbeth Richter, the German prisoner. She was becoming Nurse Elsbeth, the woman with the quiet voice and the healing hands. It was a fragile, hard-won peace, a new identity forged not in the fires of nationalism, but in the daily crucible of service and compassion. The years flowed by, carrying with them the slow, steady work of healing, both for a continent ravaged by war and for a small group of women who had chosen to build new lives on foreign soil. The epilogue of their story is not one of grand historical drama, but of quiet, meaningful lives, a testament to the profound and lasting impact of a single choice made in the aftermath of unimaginable conflict. We jump forward 35 years, to the summer of 1981. In a small, well-tended garden in a village not far from where the Hollington camp once stood, an elderly woman is on her knees, carefully pulling weeds from around a row of flourishing carrot plants. This is Elsbeth. Her hair is silver now, her face lined with the intricate map of a life fully lived, but her eyes still hold the same intelligent, observant light. She is no longer Nurse Elsbeth, the paroled German worker. She is Matron Richter, the recently retired and highly respected head of the local cottage hospital. She married a local widower in the 1950s, a quiet man whose life, like hers, had been irrevocably shaped by the war. She raised his two children as her own and became an integral, beloved part of the community that had once viewed her with such suspicion. Her story, and the story of the other Hollington women who stayed, had become a piece of local folklore, a tale of reconciliation told to new generations. Ingrid had married a farmer and, with her renowned skill as a seamstress, built a successful business making curtains and wedding dresses, her creations adorning homes and churches throughout the county. Most of the others had similar stories, tales of assimilation and contribution, of putting down new roots in the soil they had once been forced to till as prisoners. A young historian from a nearby university has come to interview Elsbeth for a project on the local impact of the war. They sit in her sun-drenched living room, drinking tea, surrounded by photographs of her family, her late husband, her children, her grandchildren. The historian asks her about the camp, about the decision to stay. Elsbeth speaks thoughtfully, her voice still carrying a faint, melodic German accent. "We were taught that we were a master race," she says, looking out at her garden. "We believed our culture was superior in every way. The British, they did not try to argue with us. They did not give us lectures on democracy. They simply showed us, through their actions, that we were wrong." She tells him the story of the carrots, a story she has told her children and grandchildren many times. "You must understand," she explains, leaning forward, "it was not just about the taste. It was about the care. In our world, a world of grand, brutal ideas, care for small things had been lost. Care for a prisoner, care for a vegetable. It was a language we had forgotten how to speak. Sergeant Davies, he was not a philosopher. He was, I believe, a simple farmer. But he taught me the most profound lesson of my life, that decency is not a national characteristic. It is a personal choice." The historian is captivated. "And what of the others?" he asks. "The ones who went back. Did you ever hear from them?" Elsbeth's expression becomes somber. "A few. Ingrid received a letter from a woman who had returned to Hamburg. She said life was very hard. But the hardest part was the bitterness, the anger that never went away. And she heard about Magda." Her voice drops. Magda never recovered. She could not accept the new Germany. She spent her life clinging to the old lies, telling anyone who would listen that the Third Reich had been betrayed. She died alone, a prisoner of her own hatred to the very end. The contrast is stark and powerful. The women who chose to embrace a new reality found community and purpose. The one who clung to the old ideology found only isolation and despair. Later, Elsbeth walks the young historian through her garden. She stoops down and, with a practiced twist, pulls a large, perfect orange carrot from the dark earth. She takes it to an outdoor tap, washes the soil from it, and breaks it in half, offering a piece to him. He takes it, and they stand there in the quiet afternoon sun, munching on the crisp, sweet vegetable. "It is a good carrot," the historian says, smiling. "Yes, Elsbeth replies, a lifetime of meaning in her simple word. It is. Her story was a quiet one, a footnote in the grand, violent history of the 20th century. But it contains a truth as perennial as the seeds she plants each spring. That transformation is always possible. That reconciliation begins not in treaties or grand gestures, but in small, unexpected acts of kindness. And that sometimes the most powerful weapon against a hateful ideology is not a bomb or a bullet, but a simple demonstration of a better way to live, a truth that can be understood in any language, a truth that can, on rare and beautiful occasions, taste as sweet as a well-tended carrot.